Hi, I'm Steve Hassan, and I'm very honored to have with me Pamela Dyson, who wrote a book about her memoir, being a high-ranking disciple, secretary directly to Yogi Bhajan of the 3HO group, which I consider to be a destructive cult and have since 1980 when I first started talking to former members who had run away from it. And Pamela, I want to thank you for your courage to share your story because I understand a lot of people who had been raised in 3HO, who've done business with 3HO, people who had joined and left, are reading the book and their eyes are opening to a whole perspective they had never known about because of the secrecy, because of the cultish nature of the cult. So thank you for agreeing to do this interview with me. And I know you're lucky. You're in Maui, one of my favorite places on earth to
Yeah,
visit.
it's
So
one of the best places on earth, I think.
yeah, it is. It is
Yeah,
great.
yeah.
So so many people have seen people wearing white turbans, some with a little sword. What's the name of the sword? The
Kirpan,
yeah.
Kirpan. Yeah,
Yes, and a lot of people don't understand that there is the um, Sikh religion that's been in existence for a really long time, and Yogi Bhajan actually his roots was, if I remember correctly, he was a customs inspector at the airport in India with no religious training at all, came to the US, started teaching yoga, and eventually proclaimed himself as, the great head of the Sikh order, to
right.
which, the real Sikhs are like, what? Um, but it's become a billion-dollar enterprise with different
Yeah,
organizations
yeah,
that members have started, including Yogi Tea and Akal Securities, just to mention two. And before I start asking you directly questions, I'll just plug a really well-researched article by B. Schofield and GuruMag.com, where she documents so much about the criminal activities, the drug smuggling, the sexual abuse cases and such. So we're going to add a link to that article as well. But
okay.
now I want to talk about you, if I may. And my understanding is that you got involved in your 20s and stayed till you were 40, 41 or something before
Exactly.
your exit. And tell us what you think might be what the thumbnail of what's wrong with this organization from your own direct firsthand experience, Pamela.
Well, one thing I have been learning is how hindsight is 2020. And I came to meet Yogi Bhajan in 1968. I was 25, and it was in the height of the love generation.
Right.
And I was in Los Angeles, and I was very much on my own, and I was exceedingly vulnerable. I had moved from Seattle, Washington, and I was really naive, really not a worldly person. I
Mm-hmm.
kind of, Seattle, when I grew up and where I grew up in Ballard, was like a small town.
Right.
And suddenly I was in the big city, and I was looking for safety, actually, when you come right down to it. It was like I was attractive, and I was working as an executive secretary at that point, and I was looking for um, a spiritual lifestyle,
Mm-hmm.
and to have a person who could guide me to the right way of living
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep.
and provide safety in a world where all the rules were, all the structure of the culture that I had grown up with was all kind of coming down, you know. Everybody was high on LSD and
Yeah.
marijuana, and we were all saying, you know, protesting the Vietnam War, and we were awakening to, you know, concept of oneness. And
Yes.
I'd had a profound experience of that myself in my early teens, you know,
Hmm.
an awakening experience in the forest of Washington State. And so now I was like looking for somebody to really guide me.
Yep.
And I just stumbled upon, happened to learn about Yogi Bhajan. And when I attended my first yoga class with him, he interviewed me to take the yoga class. And I'm going,
Well,
why
you
would
were beautiful. And I came to learn that he loved, you know, beautiful white women.
Yeah, well, I think in a way I'm finding it's the opposite, I think. But anyway, yes,
Mm.
he liked to dominate them, let us say.
Right.
And so in the interview, of course, all he did was ask about me and my history, and learning that I was just recently divorced from a 2-year marriage, that I was planning to go to Europe and find my guru, and that I was, you know, seeking from an Eastern perspective because I didn't buy into the Christian mythology anymore.
Right.
Um,
And didn't you tell him that you had been an executive secretary?
yes, he was
I'm
asking
sure
me
his
about
eyes
my
went
position.
wide on that. Oh, I can use her.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, after that first class, he took me back to a library section of the East West Cultural Center, and brought down a book of translation of the Sikh scriptures, asked me if I could type up this English translation and make it into a pamphlet for him
Hmm.
for his classes. Um, and that was, so he immediately began to draw me in. And within 2 days after that, he called me at home and invited me on a picnic. So he was, you know, he was reeling me in.
Yep.
Um,
Did he offer to pay you for the translation, or he
oh
just asked?
no, oh no, would you
Yeah.
just
So the fact that you were willing to do it for free was a green light for him to keep
sure,
asking for more of
sure.
different things.
And of course, in that first yoga class, he put me into a yoga posture and told me to stay in that posture and not to move until he gave me the signal. And then he left the room. I heard the door close. So my mindset was conditioned by books like Autobiography of a Yogi
Oh yeah.
and other books that I was reading about spirituality, the way of a Sufi, and I was also reading Krishnamurti. I was reading Jung. I was reading a lot of things really
Sure.
on my own quest. And
Sure.
so when he left the room, I'm going, what? In my head, but I'm thinking, okay, maybe this is a test. This is a test. He's testing me because that's what these teachers do. And so I held the posture, even though it was quite uncomfortable. My face was down in the floor, and my legs, my knees were splayed out, and the hips were screaming at me, and the knees were screaming, but I held it. And finally, after somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes, he came back, and I was highly relieved. So he right away was testing me, testing my pliability, testing my boundaries, and
Your obedience.
my obedience, exactly.
Yeah, and the way these cult leaders recruit is incremental, and you don't know what you're getting involved with. So there's an invitation to project onto the leader your own
Absolutely.
fantasies of goodness and love and spiritual enlightenment
Right,
instead of
right,
seeing what's actually there and having a more skeptical mind of you prove to
right,
me how great you are before I give you any obedience and such.
right. I had, you know, it's like now I know, I mean, in Buddhism, they suggest that you examine your teacher's behavior for about 12 years
Yes.
before you ever agree
Yeah.
to
I
accept
was
him
that
as
the
your
Dalai
teacher.
Lama. There was someone major in Buddhism said, I think it was the Dalai Lama. He said, you know, don't just follow anybody, and really watch whether someone is living the teaching for a
Whether he's
really long time.
practicing what he preaches, exactly.
Yep.
So naively and ignorantly, I had no clue about those instructions. And I was simply trying to be that student who was in the right place at the right time to have the teacher show up.
Oh, you were so
And
lucky, right? Lucky. That's how I felt when I met Moon, the
yeah,
Messiah, the
yeah,
Korean Messiah. I was so
yeah,
fortunate.
so blessed. And
Yes.
yes. And yeah, so he reeled me in quickly. He you know, had me start accompanying him and the woman who had been with him for a month or two longer, named Shakti Parwakar. And she was at that point the main person who drove him. And she was the same age as he was. Um, and
How much older was he than you, Pamela?
he was like 13 to 14 years older than me.
Right.
I was 25 and he was 39,
Mm-hmm.
40, going on 40. And so he was, you know, he was very charismatic, very exotic, you know, this tall, huge man. He was over 6'2", and he was around almost, well, when I met him, he'd been on a 40-day fast, so he was trim for him, because really he became obese eventually, and he was way overweight for most of his life.
Right.
But at that time, he was trim, he was stunning, he was charismatic, he was exotic. He wore this, you know, colorful turban. He was dressed in Western clothes at that point. He didn't wear any special garb.
Right.
And he was just teaching yoga. And he didn't really allude too much to the Sikh aspect, because really nobody knew anything about Sikhism in this country.
And probably he didn't either.
Right. Actually, his mother was Hindu and his father was Sikh.
Oh, okay.
So he wore the turban and he identified as Sikh.
I see.
But he actually didn't have a huge background in studying that particular.
Right. He was certainly no scholar. In my understanding, he was smuggling things from the New Delhi airport before he came to the US to become a yoga teacher.
Yeah, I think he had a whole lot of history from India. And we didn't have the internet, and we didn't have Google search. We didn't have a way to track where this person came from, and we didn't think that way at that time. This is, you know.
Well, I got in 74, so, you know, a little bit later, but I was in that same generation, because I have two older sisters, you know, protesting the war in Vietnam and etc.
Right.
But he changed your name, right, when he gave you another.
Well, he didn't formally give me a name. He quickly had me move into the house that he was living in with a few of his other students. And once I was being his attendant and really there, he started calling me Premka. And so, I mean, there wasn't any.
Got it.
Yeah.
So that's why you wrote your memoir as Premka, and then White Bird in a Golden Cage.
Right, right.
So the metaphor was that you were enslaved psychologically?
Well, the metaphor is that you find as you read the book how much he kept me confined. I was placed on, or in his mind, I was on a pedestal, and I should be thrilled at being on this pedestal. But I began to discover that the pedestal was more of a prison cell. So rather than use the analogy of a prison, I used the birdcage.
Right.
And the need to fly from that birdcage.
But you open the book with you bleeding from an abortion of his, because he was having sex with you, even though everyone didn't know that.
Right. He was married. He had 3 children. He hadn't seen them until our first trip to India in 3 years. And yeah, he initiated sexual activity between us, and in that same mindset of he's the teacher, and if that's what he is doing and that's what he's saying, that must be okay. And also naively that it must be protected by God himself because I got pregnant, and that was highly unexpected. I didn't think that
Right.
that could happen, that somehow he had more control, more wisdom, more whatever, and that it would not happen. I was not using birth control. I had used birth control pills in my marriage, and I had a problem with them, and I couldn't really continue to use them. So
Uh-huh.
I was vulnerable.
But didn't he order you to abort?
Yeah, yeah. He just told me, don't be emotional. I'll take care of it. We're going to India. And at that time, abortion was not legal in the United States.
Mm.
So we went off to India, and it's kind of a horror story, taking me to a small clinic. It was also not legal to have abortions in India, by the way, which
Yeah.
I didn't know. But anyway, and he claimed this woman he was taking me to was a doctor, but I'm certain that she was not.
Mm.
And yeah,
Yeah, you're
so
lucky you lived.
I'm lucky I lived. It was nearly 3 months later when we were flying home from India, and I started hemorrhaging on the flight. And fortunately, we were doing a fuel stop in London, and I was taken by ambulance to Hillingdon Hospital
Yeah.
and was left there. He continued on with the flight. One of his students was in London, and he was assigned to look after me as I got out of the hospital and to get me back on a flight to Los Angeles again.
Right. Oh my goodness, so many stories. I don't kn- I know we've talked in the past, and I know about a legal case where you talk about being forcibly abused by him. I don't know if you're comfortable sharing any of that in this interview.
Yeah, I, one of the things I did start off the book with such a shocking story. It's called a hook in writing,
Yes.
a way to really draw people in. But I didn't sensationalize the sexual aspect of it, other than that basic introduction. I think that what was revealed through the book, what people really have been moved by, because the book just blew apart the Kundalini Yoga world, which I had no idea had become so huge. And I think what really was so impactful to people was, first of all, my honesty in my own taking my own responsibility for
Mm-hmm.
having been so gullible and for having participated to the level that I did. Um, what was so moving, I believe, to people, and what I hear over and over again, is the way they get to hear. What they learn about him is from his own dialogue. What they learn about, the way that he manipulated is through that dialogue with me, our exchanges through events and dialogue. So I think, that's the more interesting part of what occurred is is mind, um, the mind control aspects of how he operated from the very beginning. One of the strongest teachings he gave us was never to listen to any negativity towards the teacher.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry for laughing, but it's
yeah,
such a universal with the destructive
perfect.
cult leaders. You're not allowed to criticize the leader, the doctrine, or the group. You're not allowed to talk to anybody else except your superior,
And
if at all.
if you hear anything negative against the teacher, it will poison you. It will take you down. It will take you away from your spiritual path and your spiritual
Right.
destiny. It's one of the most fearsome things to avoid is to ever hear negativity about your teacher and to have doubt.
Yes.
To have doubt. Um,
In other words, to think for yourself about what you're experiencing directly.
right, right. And so, what my book also shares so effectively is the dual voices in my own mind, the fight, the struggle with my doubts, with my logical perceptions versus
Sure.
my commitment and my dogmatic faith.
Sure.
And yeah, so I think that people really, really were, they could really identify, people could really
Yeah.
identify what my process was.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And I guess I want to just comment that, um, you know, all mind controllers don't want to take responsibility for the abuse. So they always make it someone else's fault for whatever happened. Even if the person gets raped, they get blamed for being so pretty or for having seduced them.
Right.
Everything gets projected and twisted around, and the leader's always perfect. Sounds like somebody in the White House. Always, they always got it right.
I'll tell you, the correlation watching Donald Trump is just
Yeah, it
unbelievable.
really is stereotypical, but I wrote a whole book about that. But
Yeah, I
this
have
is,
to read that book.
I would love for
I
you.
mean, I'm watching this and it's just like, oh my God, we were in a training to to observe how a narcissistic sociopath operates.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I have a chapter actually where I compare Trump with Jim Jones and Hubbard of Scientology and Sun Myung Moon, my former cult leader, and a few other luminary destructive cult leaders. But back to your experience, um, you know, there's an internal world and then the perception that's needed to be projected
Mm,
elsewhere. And I have a little diagram from Combating Cult Mind Control
mm,
where if you're down here, it looks very different than if you're in staff or you're in one of these extended retreats, or if you're one of the core devotees, or if you're in leadership. Reality has very different layers and
mm.
compartments. Would
Yeah.
you share something about that? As
Well, well, progressively, I was pushed into the role of being the administrator. And I was administrator over a staff of women. He only kept women around him close. And when asked why, he would say, because male ego cannot tolerate another male ego. And yeah, that was a good one. But I would also say that because he could keep control over a group of women, especially if those women have close personal relationships with him.
right,
And he also keeps everybody off center by dividing and conquering. That was one of his major strategies.
right,
And so each woman is basically of this staff that is supposed to be now my staff, um, is essentially in competition with one another for his attention, for his
yeah,
affection, for his time, for his exclusive time, whatever.
right.
And so everybody's always off balance. Everybody is always competitive towards one another. We can't really bond and be good friends.
Yeah, and aren't you also encouraged to tell on someone else if they're having doubts or they're doing something?
Oh, certainly, you have
Right.
to report. You have
So
to
you can't
report
have
in.
friends because
No,
you can't trust
no,
anybody, right?
no, and I wasn't, and none of us were allowed to have contact with men in
Hmm.
the community. I actually, my job was the head of the Tulsa Council, which was the Council of Ministers. My title he gave me for that was Secretary General. And I was the first Secretary General. It became after I left, it moved on to other people. But
And what year did you leave, Pamela?
1984.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry to
Oh,
interrupt you.
hey, is that the title of a book?
Yes,
Yeah, I think so.
George
Okay.
Orwell.
Yeah, yeah. So I hadn't actually associated that, but that's the truth. That's when I
Yeah,
left.
but I
And
interrupted you. So you were Secretary General over the whole council.
over the Tulsa Council, and the
Yeah.
Tulsa Council was set up as it was this council that was supposed to be a theoretically sort of a governing body over the whole, organization, which had proliferated into about 130 centers throughout the world, and so it was sort of the heads of ashrams, and they were made ministers of the Sikh Dharma, the Sikh religion, and then that they formed a council as appointed by Yogi Bhajan himself, and I was the head of that council. So the actual relationships and friendships that I felt more compatible with was this peer group of the male leaders of ashrams, because they were who I had to stay in contact with. We met 4 times a year, and
And they had to look up to you.
yeah, there was a lot of respect for me. I mean, my position, my title, Yogi Bhajan always kind of promoted and exalted me, and kept me in that isolation. I was sort of untouchable, um, and and then I was, the head of this council, and had to organize the council, and I was the consistent head of it, because it had a chairperson, but the chairperson was elected every year or 2 years or something. I can't remember, but I kept the continuity of projects and agendas, and
Uh-huh.
so yeah.
Well, I wanted to know what year you left, because I have a personal and professional piece of information for the listeners of this,
Yeah.
and that is, so I got the program from the Moonies in '76 and started learning about brainwashing and mind control for years, and sought
Mhm.
out former military intelligence people, etc. But there was a missing element for me, and I didn't know what it was until 1980, when I first was exposed to something called neuro-linguistic programming, or
Mhm.
NLP.
Yeah.
I met Richard Bandler, who I thought was a sociopath right off, but I
Mm.
was intrigued to understand, what is this thing, hypnosis? And I wound up moving with my then wife to Santa Cruz to become trained as a trainer in NLP, and became an apprentice to John Grinder, although that was at the period where Bandler's wife was leaving him and the whole thing started breaking apart as a formal structure. And I should add, Tony Robbins learned NLP, and his work is based on NLP.
Oh,
But
wow.
where I'm getting to is, when I was being trained, I got to know that Yogi Bhajan was being trained in NLP,
Really?
which is covert hypnotic processes. And NLP is based on the work of a psychiatrist named Milton Erickson,
Mhm.
Erickson,
Mhm.
who developed a process form of hypnosis, which is very powerful. And a lot of cult leaders use hypnotic processes, but Yogi Bhajan was the first actual cult leader who I knew was studying mind control techniques in order to use it to control women, to control men, to make money, to have sex, to have more power. So I'm hoping more of that story will emerge in the future. But
Wow. Yeah.
I did
Yeah.
want to
I mean,
say that.
I knew that NLP was kind of around, and I actually heard somewhere along the way that he told people not to learn it. I suppose that was so that they wouldn't figure out what he was doing.
Bingo. Bingo, because
Yeah.
then people could see the patterns,
Yeah.
the linguistic patterns,
Yeah.
and it would take away some of the aura, the mystical, sacred aura.
Yeah.
of him. But is it true that, because I think it's true based on some of the people I've helped who've left the group, that he would sometimes assign who's going to marry who and then initiate
Oh,
the woman sexually for the husband to
oh,
kind
no.
of show him how to do it?
Oh, no. Not that part.
Not that part.
No, but he did arrange marriages a lot.
Uh-huh.
And he started that very soon.
I have at least one former client married that told me that he did have sex too.
With his wife.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, since my book came out, I have learned so much more about the abuses that so much that I had no idea.
Yep.
I mean, my book is so mild.
Well, there should
But
be a
that's
follow-up. If not yours, someone else should write something and we can like document a lot of these stories.
I tell you, well, there is a group that's been hired now by the organization called an olive branch, which is set up to have people come in and tell their stories of abuse, various stories of abuse. And it's going to be made public, that document. It won't have names, but it will be.
Yeah, but I hope that victims are going to get money compensation from the state and not just tell the stories.
See. Right, we shall see. And I am putting the encouragement out in various avenues that these victims need to organize themselves to make clear what it is, what outcomes they want.
You need a good lawyer who knows about sexual abuse and mind control abuse.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of it was in New Mexico, and there's a 5-year statute of limitations in New Mexico on sexual abuse, and he's been dead for 15, 16 years already.
So, but there's a whole movement to, especially with child sexual abuse, to lift the statute of limitations.
Right.
So I'll put it in the blog, but childusa.org is Marcy Hamilton, an attorney at the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay. Yeah.
And
let me know about that.
Absolutely. And really there's monetary compensation that should be brought for the victims.
Absolutely.
And not just telling their story or signing any type of legal documents without lawyers approving.
No, they're not signing off on anything, and Olive Branch is not even, they're only there to gather the stories as a neutral body, and then to put it out, and supposedly 3HO can't interfere with any of what, they can't ask for any of the names, they can't interfere with the process. And then Olive Branch's function is to make it a public statement, 25 teenage girl rapes, whatever it may be.
I just really, really, really want to implore whoever is sharing their stories to get a good lawyer and organize together. And there are other cases against other cults, so they don't need to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
And
well, unfortunately, most of these cases, they're still people, they are still in the community. And so they are, they have a huge pressure to not rock the boat. My book has rocked the boat big time, and lots of Kundalini yoga centers and teachers are finally taking down his photographs, and they're removing the as taught by Yogi Bhajan.
Good.
So there's a huge backlash. But then I just saw today there's a petition coming from the other direction saying, oh no, we can't do this. Our precious master, sign the petition. Don't let them take down his name. Don't let them take down his picture. So it's It's a war. It's a riot out there.
Well, I'm on the side of all victims of mind control cults,
Absolutely.
and really, there was, is it Miri Puri
Yeah,
Academy
academy. Yeah.
in India?
Yeah.
Say a few things of what you know about that.
Well, fairly early on, he came up with the idea of sending children to an academy. It was in Missouri at the time. It had nothing to do with the organization really, but
Mm-hmm.
it was a boarding school in the foothills of the Himalayas in India.
Mm-hmm.
And he began to pressure parents to send their children to India. And it actually, then he gradually began to evolve. We would have our own school. Um, I wish to have put a disclaimer. I was in charge of the administration of the Secretariat and the Khalsa Council, and I oversaw the summer and winter solstices. I had a very full plate by the time that I left of responsibilities. And one of them was not anything to do with the children's program and the children's school.
Uh-huh.
Um, and it was put in the hands of Dr. Satkar Palkar in Eugene, Oregon. She was overseeing it all. She was handling the funds and the finances and everything. But that school and that evolution, as we're now hearing from those children, they call themselves the second generation.
Yep.
So those people are in their up to their mid 40s now.
Yes.
And they were sent away from their parents, sent away to school in India, and have horrendous stories of physical abuse, I believe even some sexual abuse, and just the separation, the distance and the separation
Yeah,
from their
separation from
families.
parents.
And nobody could, not very many people could afford to commute to India to see their kids or to afford to have their kids come home. So they were really, it was a Lord of the Flies kind of a situation.
Yeah, it's terrible.
And yeah, and they bonded very tightly with one another, and that's one of the things that they hold as, very special part of the experience. But the horror stories are just very, very painful to read.
And I found that working with people born in cults, that it really helps to meet other people who are born in other cults and to learn of those stories, because it's so much easier to hear about a different group and then go, oh, that was horrible.
Yeah.
But that also gives you a frame to go, but my experience was pretty much like that in different ways, and this way it's the same, and this and this. But I find, because I'm a mental health professional, that ultimately healing, it really depends on understanding psychology and the psychology of abuse, understanding about narcissists who are psychopaths and how they're wired, and understanding that it wasn't your fault. And it wasn't your parents' fault if you were sent there either, because the parents got extreme pressure.
Yeah.
But rewiring your own brain and emotions so that you're in the present in your body. So many former cult members still have dissociative disorders and issues around identity.
And then what to speak of is, I've learned that those same first generation daughters were groomed and brought in to work in the headquarters, and then they were assaulted by him.
Yes.
And physically raped, physically beaten. I mean, the stories that I have heard have just been utterly heartbreaking, utterly heart-wrenching.
Yes.
And the organization is just parts of it continue to be in extreme denial. Some of them are trying to be open-minded and let the stories be told and revealed now. But I have no idea where they're going to end up. And
Unless they take in my point of view, is unless they're willing to actually look at the literature on brainwashing and cults and mind control and encourage everyone to read and learn about that,
so
they're just going to be trying to keep their own agenda going to keep
right.
people faithful.
Well, there were a couple of brilliant things that this Yogi Bhajan did. One of them was to overlay the Sikh Dharma into the community. That has kept them from being willing to agree that they're a cult, because this is a nearly 600-year-old religion, and they believe we are following a religion. We're not in a cult. So he did some really, really clever things that keep people from ever being willing to relate to that concept of being a cult.
Except if they talk to actual Sikhs who know about Bhajan and all the creepy things.
Oh, yeah.
And say Kundalini Yoga is not part of the Sikh religion.
I know. And
right?
Yeah, no.
So they need a reference point of what is, legitimate Sikh religion to
but see,
separate.
they've been fighting with the Indians forever, trying to claim their being, valid Sikhs, and the Indians saying, no, you're not, because of Kundalini Yoga. Well, that's not the real because.
Right.
That's only part of the because.
Right.
And at the time, in the beginning, Kundalini, the yoga was taught and the Sikh religion was taught. They weren't merged. They have now merged.
Yes.
And so,
there's going to be more that needs to come out, but I can only hope with your courage and your honesty to share your story as someone who occupied such a high position in the group, and I will call it a cult because I'm a cult expert.
Yeah.
And I laid out the bite model, and I have criteria that all matches that people check out. My hope is that more people will come forward and tell their stories and not just depend on the group to gather the stories, but actually, get some good lawyers and do some really good psychological counseling.
Yes, I would really hope that happens.
I know at least 2 long-term 3HO members who are psychologists who are long out, and
so do I.
And happy to help. If people want to email me, I can refer them on, or they can contact you if there's a way that people can find you easily. And I guess I'm looking at the clock, so I'm wondering in the next 10 minutes. So I wanted to. My understanding is that he was a misogynist. That he really didn't respect women as equals. Is that?
No, absolutely not. I think he actually, there was a major teaching which most of the women didn't like too much, but it was really brought in very strongly, which is that a woman's response to her husband in the case of dispute is, I'm sorry, you're right, it's the will of God. So
I'm sorry for laughing.
Yeah. Well,
I would love my wife to use that one sometime, but it will never happen.
No, but
that's a joke. Sorry, Misha.
No, but that's what he was teaching, and he taught women's camps. He women. It's the same thing. The women are going inside of the community, inside of the cult. It's like, how could he have abused women? He exalted women. He taught all these teachings in these camps for women. Again, another brilliant subterfuge.
Brilliant in quotes, by the way, more like devious or clever. Yeah.
And at the same time, he is harshly, dominatingly abusing women, that we don't even know what's going on. We don't know that. And he manages to keep it all
But you
covered.
knew it directly.
Well,
You
I knew it
experienced
in my own personal
right.
sense, but I had no idea that he was doing this with young,
Got it. So
and that he was so physically abusive in it.
yes, he was a monster, is
Yeah,
how former members described him.
yeah.
And is it also fair to say he was anti-gay?
Oh, very much. Yeah, he was very abusive to some of the gay members. He called them out in front of the entire, like, 1,000 people at a solstice gathering, and basically drove them out right then and there.
Yeah, so he made it like you can never be spiritually evolved because you're a
Right,
deviant kind
right,
of
right.
theme.
Yeah, and it was very, very excruciatingly shaming. And I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think I ever witnessed that happen, but those are some of the stories that have come
Yeah, no,
since.
I've heard that from
Yeah,
former clients as well.
yeah.
And is it fair to say he was also racist?
I think he was exquisitely racist. It just occurred to me that he was like about 18 probably when partition happened.
Mm,
So he grew up in India. He actually grew up in what became Pakistan with the partition. Um, and so, as an Indian member of that society, a dominating white culture that used everyone in India as like servants, that regarded them as lesser and lower. And so I think that he, in many ways, acted out this immense hatred of whites, of the white people. I think that's part of what he was doing with us, was,
mm-hmm.
this hatred. And he also had a huge thing with his mother, because the only story that I recall of him ever telling about his mother was the time she came in when he was working as a customs inspector, and he was in his office, and there was something he had to do, a decision he had to make, and she didn't agree with what he was choosing to do. She came marching into his office. She was a big woman. She was almost as big as him.
Mm.
Yeah, she was huge. And she came in and smacked him upside the head and knocked off his turban. And he always told that story, and how the worst, the most humiliating thing you can ever do to a Sikh man is to knock off his turban.
Mm.
And so I feel that he hated his mother. And he had to, try to take on that domination of the feminine, as an expression of his
Mm-hmm.
superiority. Yeah.
So, if I'm remembering correctly, he told you when you were in the cult that your destiny was never to get married, but you left with a man you fell in love with, married, and had a child. Is that
I
correct?
did. I did.
Yay!
I have a 33-year-old son, and he's wonderful.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
And I really, really, really want to underscore there's life after cult, even with
Yeah,
all the phobias that the cult
yeah.
leader and the cult put in your head, that you're going to lose your spiritual soul and your salvation, and
Mhm.
demons are going to possess you, and all these other crap nonsense
Yeah,
things.
yeah,
That once you clear away all the indoctrination, you can like reclaim your life and do
yeah,
what is you, authentically you.
yeah, exactly. I think that, I mean, what I know from, working so long and hard on my own, um, gaining my own self back, um, actually was getting my own self in the first place, because I was so susceptible because I didn't have good self-esteem.
Mm,
I was not raised to think well of myself. My mother was
mm,
young when she had me. She was only 18, and
mm.
she was vain, and not a motherly kind of mother. And she tended to just always put me down, compare me, um, and made me feel less always. So
Mm.
I was very vulnerable to somebody who wanted to make me special.
Yeah, but you know
And
what?
mm,
Everybody's not perfect, and no matter how what their family was. You
exactly.
also had undergone a divorce. You had moved to a new state and a new
Yes, yes.
city, and you
So
were
many
living in a
vulnerabilities.
turbulent time.
Yeah, many vulnerabilities all at once. And so my process and what I share in the book is is a prolonged process of psychological um, counseling and all kinds of different therapies and just finding my way to me.
Yay! And one more
Yay.
time, please get this book and read it and share it. And thank you so
Uh,
much for writing it and being willing to do this interview.
Thank you.
And let's stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you. I
Thank you
appreciate it.
so much. Bye bye.
Love. Bye.